part of the interviews for the oral history project, part of the 50th anniversary. It's being done on December 15th, 1994, in room B836 in the Science Department. I'm Carol Pohl. I teach sociology and social science department. And I'm going to turn over to the interviewees if they would give their name and their present position. Okay.
Hi, I'm Joe Costelli, Professor Joe Costelli, and I'm chairperson of the Science and Math Department. Barry Ginsberg, Professor Dr. Barry Ginsberg.
Professor of Math and Science, Professor Emeritus, and I recently retired.
Okay. Why don't we think about the oral history in terms of the chronology of it? And since I think you're the first person, Barry, to start at FIT, if you could just tell us about what it was like in the early days, how long you've been at FIT.
All right, I've been at FIT pretty close to 40 years now, I think a year or so shy. I first came to FIT in 1956, and FIT in those days was 2 floors in the Fashion Industry High School on 25th Street, I think it is, and the science office was a little narrow room where if one person wanted to walk into the office, the other person had to stand up and let him go by. In those days, the chairman of the department was Bill Leider, and there were just 2 or 3 faculty members, myself, Irving Hauptman, and Irene Berger. And the faculty dining room was one room in the student cafeteria. And in those days, students themselves were block programmed, which meant that they just walked in, were handed a program which they followed for 2 years. You want me to continue beyond, or what?
Yeah, if you would talk about, what the nature of the students were like. And
Well, there were about 200 students in those days, and there were 2 majors, the management major and the apparel design major, and then eventually the fashion buying and merchandising major. And the students were, as I say, about 200, the sweetest, nicest kids. And there were, I think in those days, about 15 to 20 faculty members in the entire school. And we all knew each other very, very well. In fact, one of the things the students looked forward to was every intersession. We used to go up to, I'm sure you all know, a hotel called Grossinger up in the mountains, which doesn't exist anymore. But in those days, the students and the faculty used to go up for like a midwinter vacation. And we had, I think it was 3 days and 2 nights. The students paid $25. They got all of their meals and 3 days of swimming and skating and whatever, and transportation both ways, tips included. And it's unbelievable when you talk about now what is $25.
I never heard that story. That's one.
Yeah, but a lot of funny things occurred. We were very, very close to the students. That's a difference now, and the faculty were all close. You knew everybody by their first name. And the funny thing was the school in those days was a very tightly knit school and very, very rigidly controlled. And in fact, I remember because, of things that existed, we had to make a bed check every night of all the students. And everybody was in bed, let's say, by 10, 11 o'clock in the hotel. And
What bed check, hotel? This is news to me, so
Yeah.
please elaborate on that.
when we went up to Grossinger's for
Oh, I'm sorry, at the
days-
hotel. I
yeah,
thought you
in
meant
the
that.
hotel.
Okay.
No, not here in the
Oh,
city.
I
There was no-
thought you meant the.
No,
you
there
didn't
were
have
no
the dorms,
dormitories in
exactly.
those days. There was none of these buildings were here in those days.
Absolutely.
And in fact, when we moved from there to the C building, it was quite an occasion. And we outgrew it almost the day that we moved into the building. And why don't I stop at that point, and maybe if there's some other things you want to ask, then we can go on from the history from that point. Or
But you can go on with the, up till, I guess, present and
all
see-
right, then
and
I'll
we'll-
go into a little more details.
Barry was very instrumental in the plans for these buildings, were you not?
Yeah. Actually, in the mid-'60s, I guess, and into the '70s, up till about '80, I was very, very involved, I guess, in name it, I was involved in it. I don't think anything happened in the school that Barry Ginsberg wasn't involved in some way, one way or another. And I started out, as I say, teaching in the math department. I was teaching just math, not science in those days. Science came later. And I was director of admissions initially, where I visited high schools throughout the tri-state area and several times a week, and interviewed all of our students were interviewed when they were admitted. And then with Marion Brandriss, who was the Dean of Students in those days, and technically Director of Admissions, we would go over each and every application and decide which students would come into the school. And of course, we were swamped. We could turn away students in droves. At the same time, I was working with the Dean of the college in those days was called Rosalind Snyder. And almost, I think the second year I moved in, I came into FIT, she asked me if I would act as an assistant to her and work with student programs and faculty programs. So I became, I guess it was called assistant dean in those days, and which eventually led to a position something like today the vice president of academic affairs. And I did all of the programming of classes, of faculty, of students. And as I say, they were block programs initially, and faculty was quite different. In those days, faculty had to work 5 days a week. If I had a scheduling problem and I came up with a 4-day program for a faculty member, it was thrown back in my face. We can't have that. And everyone worked 5 days a week. Nobody could teach more than 2 hours in a row, and no one could teach more than 4 hours in a total day. We taught
the total load was?
Total load in those days was 15 hours and 18 hours for lab or phys ed teachers. And as I said, I did all of this scheduling. Eventually, we broke the block program and moved into a set of programs where students could do some selection, and more as the time progressed. In fact, I think the programs that I set up, I know 20 years ago, more than that, are still basically the programs I use today. They've made really very little changes in it.
The arrangement of the liberal arts blocks, the A's and B's, C's, that's very Ginsberg's.
And it's still
work.
good or bad.
It's still there with modifications. We're still using it.
Yeah, I think I would have changed it 10 times by now, but okay, I'm not down to that.
But what led to the change to get more selection? Who prompted the change? Administration or?
Actually, I think I did. Primarily, that students used to ask me if they couldn't they have this instead of that, and the answer was no, you cannot. And we eventually tried to give the students some change, some selection. It really started out with liberal arts, and eventually, even in their majors, they began to get some change of course, some selection of course. Now, of course, they select many different things, but in those days, it just didn't exist. I'll come back to a couple things, but I then became chairman of this department in 68 through 71. I was the first elected chairman, and in those days I wrote the MA 111 and 112 outlines and the 001 and 002 remedial courses, which I'll tell you a bit about in a minute if you like. I was also a member of what was called the faculty committee in those days. Not the faculty association, it was called the faculty committee. And that was a group of faculty that set out to make improvements for the faculty and to do the things that the faculty association is doing today. And eventually, in the early 60s, that led to the faculty association. I was one of the first, I forget, the first or second chairperson of the association. And in the 60s, I think I served on, I guess, every different committee the association has today or had in those days. And then, of course, in the early 90s, it's a funny thing, I told Joe at one point I was never going to retire. And then when they offered a certain incentive at one point, I sat down just for the fun of it to do some arithmetic, and I found I would be paying to work. Really, without exaggeration, I make more, so I decided to do the thing I'd never said I was going to do, retire. And of course, I had always said one thing to myself, that I wasn't going to retire until I got to the head of the graduation list, which means I'm the most senior faculty member in the school. And I had been on that list for 3 years, so I guess it was okay to retire. I can go back to a couple of other things if you want. In the early 50s, when I came here, FIT had no medical program at all. There was no medical for faculty. And I instituted, of course, with the college agreeing to pay for it, the original medical program, which was the HIP program. And we had that for several years, and wasn't terribly satisfying. I think people who know HIP know what some of the problems were. This led, and then into the 60s, working with Nate Axelrod and with Levinson, we developed
Who are those people?
What's that?
What's the title of those people? You mentioned, what's their official
Um,
capacity? What was their official capacity?
I think they were just faculty members at that point, because Nate Axelrod eventually became dean of students.
That's before my time.
Yeah, he was several administrative positions, but in those days I think they were both just faculty members, and we worked together to.
And George Levinson, you mean?
George Levinson, yeah,
Right,
George
okay,
Levinson.
yeah.
Yeah, not Art Levinson, George Levinson. And we set up the Prudential Medical Program, which of course is substantially better than the HIP program, and eventually, of course, now it becomes Mass Mutual. About 58 or 59, I was eating lunch one day with Jeannette Jarnow, who was chairman of the merchandise department in those days, and she was bitterly complaining to me about all of the students that failed their FM22 on merchandising math. And she said she's at wit's end. She didn't know what to do. I said, maybe it's not that they can't understand merchandising math. I said, maybe the problem is they can't do the simple arithmetic, the fractions, decimals, and percents. She said, fine, you're in the math department, do something about it. So in those days, we built up a course and a testing program where we tested all entering merchandising students. And those that failed this test, I developed a course called MA001, which was 1 hour a week, which just included basic arithmetic, fraction, decimals, percents. And with students taking this course, the passing grade in FM22 went up dramatically. So of course this became a permanent part of FIT, although now the course is extended in hours and work and so forth. Shortly after that, we instituted a remedial program for management students, which was called MA002, something somewhat similar, although more in the algebra line. Part of my programming of classes, it's kind of interesting. When I was programming the classes, I was working with a gentleman called Newt Godnick, who has been, is recently retired, the chairman of the merchandising department. And we used to work down in a little teeny room in this building, in the C building, in the basement. And we used to work with a young girl. We had a secretary who was about 19 years old, 18, 19 in those days, and the three of us used to do programs. Of course, today, Newt Godnick, after being chairman of the merchandising department, has retired. And the young 18-year-old girl, his name is Vicky Barbero, who is the, of course, executive secretary of the college and has worked closely with the president and so forth and so on, but things do move on. A couple of the other things that were done, I guess, that I worked in. One was in 1964, we had a problem that we just didn't have enough room for the students that we had. And I proposed a program which we called the PM program, whereby students who did not get into our regular program were admitted to a summer session where they took 2 or 3 courses in summer session, and then if they were successful in this, they would then go into our evening division for the next semester, and then the students that passed both of these, by the time second semester came along, you always get some dropout, were able to move into the second semester. So in this way, we used to take in about 100 students that couldn't have got into the school otherwise. From this, I actually developed a summer session program, which of course eventually led to all students taking the summer session program we now have, and then of course a winterim later on. I think one of the things that I did that, well, beside my teaching, that gave me the most satisfaction was after we moved into this building. Shirley Goodman called me in one day and she said, Barry, we have outgrown this building. We're here 2 years and we just are swamped with applications. And we
You say this building, you mean C building.
I'm sorry, I mean the C. Yeah, I'm sorry. Because she spoke to me in the C building.
Right.
But okay, you're absolutely right. Thank you, Joe. It was the C building, which of course was our first building. And she said, we have to undertake a program where we are going to, and she was very visionary, knock down all the buildings on 27th and 28th Street, which we never did because a couple of them held out. And we're going to build a half a dozen different buildings in a massive, massive construction program. And I want you to determine how many buildings not so much, but how many classrooms we need, what we need in all those rooms, and what classes the students will take. And this took me, I think, about a year. And during this year time, I met with the state architects, I met with the state governor, and I met with the school architects, and we actually established how many rooms we need, what we would need to increase our student load about 5,000 students. And a very peculiar thing happened too. We had put into the original plans a swimming pool, an underground parking lot that would go from 7th Avenue to 8th Avenue for $15 a month, both of which was thrown out by the state legislature. And also we had, I forget the point I was going to make, but okay. Oh yes, I remember. In those days, the chairman suddenly decided they would like to have big classrooms. So we put into the plans 10 classrooms for 100 students. These were liberal arts classrooms, basically. And then I finished my job, and the job went to the architects. And the chairman then changed their minds, as chairmen are prone to do. They decided we don't want these 10 big rooms, take them out. So of course the architects, I guess, I don't know, not being a liberal arts people, said, okay, you take out 10 rooms, you put in 10 rooms. So they put in 10 rooms, but 10 rooms for 30 students. So when this building opened, we were shy about 20 classrooms. So of course, if you ever walk along the corridor on the 6th floor from the A building to the B building and see all those little rooms in the walls called classrooms, they weren't there in the original plans. There was a big, wide corridor there. And we suddenly found we were short of 20 classrooms. We put classrooms wherever we could. Right out here in the hall is a little classroom, that, if you want to call it that. And I was involved in Middle States accreditation twice. Once I chaired it, and once I was just working on it. I was kind of interesting. The first professor who was appointed, who was not a chairman. Up until the time I became a professor, every professor had to be a chairman of the college. Chairman of the department. If you were not a chairman, you couldn't become a professor. I was on the UCE executive committee almost since its inception. I chaired the committee that selected President Jarvie to be president of the school. And
what criteria were you looking for in the selection of president?
Well, in those days, we were looking for somebody who, the school was growing, money was important. We were looking for somebody who could work with the outside school, raise money, work with the Board of Education. And I guess, as you know, FIT and those, well, still is really, was sponsored by the Board of Education and the State University of New York and student tuition. So we would looking for someone who could work with the outside world as well as work with some of the bigger problems that were now beginning to get involved in the college, because we had grown to several thousand students and we needed much more than we did before. Well, I think that leads up to some of the earliest. As I was involved in mostly up till 1980, and around 1980 I had, as I say, been involved in almost everything that happened in FIT in the academic or liberal arts areas and in administration. And I kind of felt that I would like to go back to really what was my first love, so I left the administration areas and moved into teaching back in full time, which I did until 91 when I did retire. And the department did bestow upon me the honor of appointing me Professor Emeritus, which is something that not too many people in this college have. I think at the point I had it, only 13, 14 people had it in all the years, and they were primarily older chairmen.
I'd like to add that we have 2 emeriti in this department, which is remarkable. Bill Leider is Professor Emeritus, Barry Ginsberg is Professor Emeritus. For a liberal arts department, that's quite remarkable.
Can we shift to you, Joe, if you would start?
Sure. You can just jump in any time you want. He's a hard act to follow. I'll start a little bit with my education. I have a BA in biology and education, which is not too common among college teachers, but my PhD is in straight evolutionary biology. I started here, which I got that in '73. I started here part-time in September '75, and I was lucky enough to get a full-time position in January of '77. And from there, my career seems to have moved rather quickly here. I became assistant chairperson in 1984. That was for one semester, and the next semester they elected me chairperson, and I've been chairperson ever since.
And we're never going to let him resign.
That's 10 years in this seat. When I first arrived at FIT, we were all in the C building, and the entire liberal arts area was in one, it's now one very large classroom on the 7th floor, is it not?
Right,
in
right.
C building. Everyone was in that. The dean, each of the English and speech, as every department was there.
What year was that?
That was in '75 when I first came here as part-time. So within that one, which is really just a good-sized classroom at this point, every department was there. So you didn't have to go far for a divisional
Each one
meeting.
had a single desk with a little glassed-in area around it.
Exactly.
No privacy.
And the cafeteria at that point was it on the 2nd floor or the 3rd floor? Or again, it was a one-room
Yeah.
deal, very, very, very small.
The library was there too, the 2nd floor.
I very early on became active in college affairs in the faculty association. My first committee, I think, was Personnel Policies Committee, and from there I went to Academic Standards, where I raised a few eyebrows by talking about grade inflation and some such things. Eventually I got to the point of being faculty association chairperson. That was in 1987, and by that time it was a full 4-year commitment, because you were chair-elect for 1 year and then actual chair for 2 years and then past chair. We had a very interesting executive committee at that point. I think half of it was science and math people on the executive committee of the college, which brings up a really interesting point. We have not a large department as the college goes, but an extremely active department in the politics and goings on of the college. I think in that semester that year or so there were 4 people from the science and math department on the executive committee of the faculty association. Because that's the one committee where you don't necessarily have to have limited representation from each department. The secretary is elected separately, the chairperson is elected separately, the number of people are elected separately. So we had 4 people. It was almost embarrassing. It seemed like the science and math department was running the college. In the history of FIT, Barry was chairperson of the faculty association. I was chairperson. Richard Harrigan was chairperson. Evelyn Stevens was chairperson. Was there anyone else?
Was Judy chairperson?
No, I don't think Judy was chair, but she's been extremely active in the union for many. Judy Parkes. Yeah, for many years. So though we're fewer numbers, our voices has been rather large.
Have there been certain themes that you've been most active in, yourself and the science and math people, do you see? Certain issues?
Well, the math remediation has been a big impetus, a big part of our functioning here. Barry started it. It is now expanded greatly. I worked to get it spread to all areas of the college. When I first came on board, there were 4 departments that didn't require it, and we got them to require. We got them to make it the administration to make it an official requirement for graduation, to put some kind of oomph behind it, because it had been a more casual thing earlier on. It was suggested that students take it. Now it's really required. Students cannot graduate if they haven't met the math proficiency, at least on the lower level.
And that was initiated primarily by your department as opposed to
Well, Barry
industry.
explained how it
Yeah.
started. Industry very definitely supports it, as do the various areas of the college. If I see one trend over the 10 years that I've been in this position, is a great shift towards math. Math has grown enormously. When I got here, Barry says he was teaching only math early on, but when I got here, there was no one teaching only math. You were teaching math and
Yes,
science,
yeah.
and there was no math full-timer, I don't think. Claire Johnson was the first full-timer who was hired in math, and that was after me, and then we hired Henry Gibson and then Renee Matte. In other words, we now have 3 math full-timers and many, many adjuncts, and back then there were none. We have many remedial classes, we have many upper division classes in statistics and finite math. There is a motion in the college or pressure to change our requirements so that students will be forced to take 1 math and 1 science. We don't kind of agree with that philosophically, but
Could you explain that a little? What do you mean?
At present, students take 2 science. Most lower division students take 2 science courses and remediation if necessary. And it's just part of a picture that I see towards a burgeoning of the math area. Let's see. I've been here long enough to be on 3 curriculum reviews. Science and Math is doing its curriculum review this semester, and it's the 3rd time I'm going through that as chairperson of a department. We have a new wrinkle this semester that we're doing student input into this process. And 2,000 questionnaires just went in faculty boxes yesterday to be distributed to students for their input. I served on 2 Middle States committees earlier on. I was part of a liberal arts committee chaired by Webb Booty. That was about 10 years ago. In the last Middle States committee, I co-chaired the steering committee with Judy Parkes.
So Joe, between you and I, we've been on all of them. I was
I
on
guess-
the first 2.
I guess so, and that was a major undertaking. We came through with flying colors in just about all of them.
Could you explain what the Middle States role is and the consequences of the review for the school?
It's a validation of our efforts here. Middle States comes and investigates every part of what we do here, from the facilities to how the plant is maintained, to the equipment we have, to the teaching, to the curriculum, to the administration. They leave practically no stone unturned. And so Middle States review means looking at every single thing that we do and putting it together in a concise and cohesive document, and hoping that it's going to be good enough. It's endless meetings and endless discussions, and finally the creating of a rather large document. And also in that process you address comments that they've made on previous reviews, and we were very careful to do all of that. We did our homework very well, I think, and the document over there is about yay thick. Also yay over there on, I won't leave myself out here, but in my spare time from all these other activities, I finished a textbook which I was working on for 16 years, and was finally published last spring, and I'm rather proud of that.
What's the title?
The title is Introductory Biology, a Molecular Approach, and it's written specifically for students at FIT, and most of my colleagues are using it, and I've been getting good feedback. Very happy about that. That's a major accomplishment. What else can I tell you? Can you think of anything else, Ryan?
Not offhand, unless there's something specific you would like to.
If we could touch upon some of the themes of how programs have developed at FIT, the role of industry, faculty, students in shaping what happens.
Each major department has an industry advisory board, and this has not happened in liberal arts. We kind of act in response to other majors. They come to us and say, we would like this or that course, and if we deem it's a valid liberal arts course, we will certainly respond. It's not totally reactive. If we feel that a certain course is appropriate for a major, we will certainly approach them and try to convince them of that fact. With our new dean, we now have a new liberal arts dean, Lois Ambash. She feels that, and I think very, very correctly so, that we would benefit from having an industry advisory board. and we are putting it together. We're putting together a board of not liberal arts people, but industry people who are interested in liberal arts and promoting liberal arts in the curriculum of our students. We feel it'll give us a much greater leverage in the college. Liberal arts has always enjoyed a very good relationship with the rest of the college. We had, for many years, we had an absolutely wonderful dean. We couldn't have this discussion without mentioning Gladys Marcus, whom we all loved and honored and respected greatly. And a lot of the position of the liberal arts at FIT is
No
due
question.
to Gladys. I lost my train of thought. I got so impressed with
The industry, about the industry
yeah.
board and how this may affect possibly course development, I assume.
Yeah, exactly. Our new dean has this idea that we should have this industry advisory board. I think it makes perfect sense. We do need every bit of leverage we can get. Though our colleagues do respect us and do feel the need for liberal arts, we do have to fight to maintain a position here. Nothing is guaranteed, nothing is automatic. We have to show our worth every step of the way. To use a case in point, if you notice, the last graduation there was no liberal arts award given, and we're fighting to get it back. The administration is not forthcoming with the funds, nor is the Educational Foundation. And for this go around, faculty in the liberal arts area are going to be asked to contribute to an award. Eventually we will get it, but it just points to the fact that though we have a good position, we also have to be constantly vigilant and improve it and develop it.
Do you see the industry making suggestions about courses as well? You know, in the area of mathematics skills and science and stuff like that?
Absolutely. We see them as making any suggestions that they wish to us. We want them to be totally open. We want to be totally open to them. If we feel it's unwise, we can respond. But I don't think it will be unwise. I think it'll be a very valid thing for us to do.
How are you identifying which industries that will sit on the board, since you're still in the early
We're going
stages?
around to various department chairs and discussing their industry advisory boards with them. We've met with Peg Smith, and she's given us a couple of names of people that are interested in liberal arts that might want to help us. And we envision meeting once or twice a semester to touch base with these people. We also feel we should have a presence on the Educational Foundation, which we really don't. There is no official liberal arts representative to the Educational Foundation.
But there have been
Meeting.
several liberal arts people who've been honored at one time or another as elected members or something.
The Educational Foundation?
I think so.
Well, we feel that there should be a standing representative of the liberal
Yeah,
arts
this
area.
didn't exist, right?
Yeah, and that.
The other divisions have?
Well,
representatives?
these are industry people on the Educational Foundation, and just about every industry and just about every discipline at the college is represented somewhere. I mean, there are many people on the board. There's 30, 40 something. I forget the exact number, but there's a considerable number of people there.
Okay.
I want to mention also Dr. William Leider, who is the professor emeritus also and the first chairperson of this department. The only reason he's not here today is because there were problems of scheduling the event, and we couldn't all three be together, but I certainly have to mention his name as being a much loved member of our department, having contributed greatly. Let's get the chronology of chair people down. Was Bill the first?
Bill was the first, and he was chairman for many years.
And then you?
Then I was chairperson.
And Evelyn was obviously after you?
Evelyn.
And Stevens? And Rika Rock for 3 or 4 years, and then myself.
I think so.
So that there have not been
A lot of chairs.
many chairs considering
The number of years.
the number of years.
Going
50
back,
years.
yeah. Well, the first years of the college had no liberal arts. Bill came in as the first. He was hired to set up this science program, and Gladys Marcus, of course, was there in those days.
And initially, the science department was the science, math, and phys ed
Phys ed
department?
department's right. Right, it broke up during the years I was chairman, actually, when it became very big. It's another cute thing I might mention that the people might be interested in terms of history, that many, many years ago, when Dean Brandriss was Dean of Students, she was a very rigid, firm believer in things should be just the way they should be. And we had a dress code in those days. First place, every faculty member went to class the way I'm dressed today, with a tie and a regular shirt and a jacket. Students, male students, also wore jackets and ties. And the females came only in skirts. There were no such thing as wearing pants. And I can still remember on cold, bitter, winter, snowy days, Marion Brandriss standing at the front door of the C building and turning away students that came in pants because of the snow. And I can see students, literally almost in tears, saying to her, "But we're just going to walk over to the bathroom and change, take off the pants. Look, I have a skirt over the pants. Out. You don't walk into this building in a pair of pants." And that has changed, of course. Of course, there was one, I don't know if you were here at that point, Joe, there was one stage in college life when students came to school as dirty as possible, with as raggedy as clothes, went a period of several years.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's, of course, changed to pretty much do whatever you want. It's also interesting that when we opened the C building, it was not air conditioned. And the administration had begged the city of New York to air condition that building. I think it was the last, although the most expensive school building ever built in New York City, one building, it was the last building not air conditioned. And I still remember one of the chairman of the board of trustees' name was Haft, a wonderful man. In fact, speaking of Haft, he used to have the faculty over Christmas time to his home. And he used to have a little party for all the faculty, and this went on for many, many years. And anyways, he spoke to the mayor of the city, and he said to him, "How can you not air condition the most expensive school building in the city of New York?" And the mayor said, "That's our policy. We don't air condition school buildings in the city of New York." So Haft said to him, "At least put in ducts. It'll cost $10,000. And the mayor said, "We don't air condition school buildings in the city of New York."
Who's the mayor?
I don't remember who he was
Mr.
at that
Lindsay?
point. And so Haft said, he took out his checkbook. He said, "I'll write a check for $10,000 and put in the ducts." And the mayor said, "We don't air condition school buildings in the city of New York." So there were no ducts. Anyways, when we built the B
Is that why all the
buildings,
ducts are exposed in the C building?
and not only that, because when we came, all the other buildings were air conditioned, and no C building, you couldn't possibly continue that way. So they air conditioned the C building. What would have cost the city nothing, because Haft would have paid for it, cost them close to $1 million to air condition the C building. So that's why some of the ducts are exposed, and they started through and they came up against dead walls and they had to go around, and quite a little problem. But anyways, I thought those two little things might be of interest.
When did the dress code stop? Do you know what year?
I would guess about the time Marion Brandriss retired, but I'm not really sure.
Do you remember approximately what
No,
year?
I don't really remember.
Could we talk a little about the students, what they were like, male, female, their ethnic backgrounds, whether working, blue-collar backgrounds, came from the industry, back in the early days, and how if you've seen any changes?
Back in the very early days, we had 200 students, and I would guess to a great extent Jewish, because the fashion industry in those days, the people themselves were primarily Jewish, and certainly I would guess almost all white, and some blue-collar worker families and many labor families. And
Laborers in the fashion industry came from...
some of their children were here, yeah, who wanted to better themselves, and who wanted, not they so much, but they wanted their children to have, as we all do, what we didn't have, And as time progressed, of course, as you well know, the student body, in those days, by the way, the student body was almost all female. There was one small class of what they called management students in those days, that wasn't the exact name, of about 20 students who were, in those days, all male. But in the rest of the school, there was almost not a male student. And of course, those 20 students were well entertained by the 200 or so girls who were in the school. And as we, again, changed majors and things changed, the student body, of course, grew and changed, and many other ethnic groups came into the school, and now, of course, the mix is substantially different than it was in those days.
Why was that class all male?
I guess in those days, remember we're talking about pretty much close to 40 years ago, and these were the students who went into the managing business in the industry, managing businesses, and I guess in those days, managers were thought of as male. Female were not.
Females weren't accepted into that program.
Not.
Are you talking managing, say, a dress factory or something
Yeah,
like that?
yeah,
That
yeah,
was
managing
pretty much a
factory,
man's.
right, and they were just men in
Women
those
were
days. just,
operators and
right.
the machines.
Exactly.
We have a much more diverse mix now, which in many ways is certainly preferable. We also have the problem of students, many of which, for many of which English is a second language, and that's becoming more and more something that we have to deal with. Students are admitted and then have a great deal of difficulty, especially in liberal arts, especially in the more verbal liberal arts such as science.
Did you see immigrant students, the students in the beginning, were they born in other countries?
Initially, not much, no. Again, when we first started, most of the students were American, white, English-speaking.
Their parents were born in other countries.
Oh, yes, sure.
They were like the first generation to go to college.
Yeah. And then, of course, it's changed now to the extent that certainly you walk into a class, and I would say 50% is American, maybe not. Maybe
American born.
50% is maybe more.
Do you think it's still first generation college for most of the students now? That they're the first generation
I think for a lot
college?
of them that I'm seeing, probably.
What are some of the countries they're from? Do you see? Any
Many
shifts?
Asian countries,
I think it
just
might-
about every country in Europe that I can see. We have Italian students, French students, Scandinavian students.
I was going to say it'd almost be easier to name the
Israeli.
students that they don't come from, the countries they don't come from. It's every
I
single-
think I forget in the Middle States report we had an actual list of the countries represented. I think there were 70 or so different countries, if I'm not mistaken, that were represented
Right.
here.
Do you encounter many students who are from the international students who study here, taking your classes?
We encounter some, certainly. But for the most part, these are excellent students, and their English is pretty. I mean, students who are actually studying
Right.
from, just come here for an occasional 1 or 2 courses
Right,
as
or
opposed to.
for a short certificate
Yeah.
or a degree program, secondary degree.
Their English is frequently better than students who are naturalized Americans, but who are still probably speaking their native tongue at home.
Could you discuss a little about the role of math and the shifting over to using computer applications in so many areas? Has this affected your
This is another
department?
big thing that we've seen, the rise in use of computers in just the 10 years since I've been chairperson. I think we did our first computer course maybe 15 years ago, something
Maybe not
like
even
that.
15
Not
years
even
ago.
that, or
I
maybe
don't think that was that
151.
far back.
I think it was probably in place when I was chair. That's why when I became chair, so maybe 12 or so years. We had an MA 151 course, which is still in existence, and still we run a number of sections of it. We have a computer component in the statistics course. We have an extra hour during which students take a computer lab, and it's done in any computer classroom. We have a classroom set up for down the hall with 12 computers to be used in finite math classes. I think that was called quantitative analysis. Finite math is,
The name's
or as a
changing,
student
right?
called me yesterday on the phone and asked for finite math. That classroom is set up for that, and we're investigating the possibility of using that classroom in off hours as an open lab, computer lab for students to be used in remediation. Our new dean is absolutely a wonderful person and has great vision, and we are looking towards a skills center, an organized testing and skills center for math, for educational skills, and part of this whole thing would be a computer lab where students could go and work at their own pace, be it in skills and math tutorial programs. So that's coming, and I think we'll get there if we ever get out of this financial crisis, which seems to be stifling just about all of our efforts to do anything bigger and better, because there's simply no extra money to do it. I think back to this was 7 or 8 years ago when President Feldman took the whole junior faculty on a retreat to this wonderful hotel somewhere. I forget exactly where it was. Hundreds of people were wined and dined for a weekend, and we talked, and it was absolutely a wonderful thing. I mean, that would be totally unheard of. There had been a senior faculty retreat, right? Did you go on that one?
Yes.
And then a while back there was, and then after that there was the junior faculty retreat, and they never did get around to the mid-range faculty. I was not junior faculty at the time, but by dint of being faculty association chairperson, I got to go to the junior faculty retreat.
There now is going to be a program which requires students to take a computer course. Does that come from this department?
In which
Isn't-
we're talking art
I
design
think-
area, computer graphics.
I think don't all students now have to take a computer course in word processing?
There have been various movements in that direction. All art and design students take a computer graphics course, which is 1 hour. B&T students, most of them get it early on in one course or another. There was a discussion a while back proposing that the science and math department test all incoming students on computer skills and then actually see them through a short module course, 5-meeting course on giving them some kind of background. That didn't come to fruition. I just pulled out that syllabus the other day. It still exists, and we may go back to it. It didn't come to fruition because each department had such different needs and wanted the course at different times, and we just couldn't see a logical way of doing it. But if we have a tutoring and skills center, it won't be called a tutoring center anymore, but a basic skills center with a computer lab, and testing possibilities, they could test not only for language skills and math skills, but for computer skills.
Okay, can you think in terms of your experiences, some key events that you would like to have included in the archives? Your experience of IT's history?
Key event. I remember that day when we were standing in C building, and the doors opened to come to these, and I just thought of the entrance of the gods into Valhalla from Das Rheingold, and as we all march ceremoniously into this building. And at that point, I honestly didn't know that you were so instrumental in making all of that happen. I was a newcomer.
That was before your time, actually.
And it's wonderful to see newer faculty not aware of the history of things, of why things were in place, and there's the fear sometimes that they don't know where it came from, a fear on my part, and they're working counter to the initial intention of why this was done, and you just have to go around and educate.
Do you think of something specifically that's come to your attention? For example, what you're talking about, a specific instance?
Teaching load was one thing. Amount of teaching that you should or could do on one day was another. There were many hard-won battles that the union won against the administration that junior faculty sometimes question and don't know the full history of, and also that sometimes they might take for granted. And knowing that it wasn't always that way, it was a much more tyrannical.
Oh, much more. There was no choice. There was no decision on anybody's part. I mean, everyone came in. The chairmen were all appointed, and the administration was all appointed, and they ran things as they wished. There was nothing anyone had to say.
such as, excuse me, the AOP list situation. I mean, that was put out as a remedy to correct injustices where chairperson were giving out programs as political favors, and the AOP list was put there so that everyone's rights were met. And there were questions about the AOP list now and its validity and whatever. And if you know the history of it and the original purpose, and if it's used in that way, there should be no problem with it.
And the AOP list is?
Assignment of program list. It's lists faculty in terms of seniority, the number of hours taught. And of course, the most senior person gets the first choice.
When did they stop appointing the chairs? Under what president, and how did it take place?
Well,
The
actually, as I mentioned, I was the first chairman of the department who was elected, and that was in, I have that date there. Yeah, in '68. So up until '68, all chairmen were appointed, and in '68, we switched to electing chair people. And the truth of the matter is, an interesting thing though, the faculty, I think, was so used to, in '68, to being told what to do and doing it, that I think almost every chairperson that had been appointed was elected. I can't remember, except maybe for myself, any chairperson who was disposed of. And someone, now of course, the complete situation has changed, and chair people are re-elected all the time very frequently. It doesn't mean anything, but in those days, in '68, was the first time.
That was under what president?
Jarvie.
Jarvie, and I assume the union played a role in that. That decision was made because of the teachers organizing?
Yeah, the decision was made because of the union. I think the union primarily. The union pushed for that very strongly, and that was something that the administration resisted just as strongly. And I think that was one of the things that, through union negotiations, the election of chair people and election of gradually other administrators as well, came from the union.
Okay, we're closing. If you have anything more you'd like to add to the archives?
Just thank you for this opportunity to become part of the whole story.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay.